April 23, 1945. The war in Europe had 8 days left, though nobody in the small American processing camp outside Heidelberg, Germany, knew it yet. What they did know was that among the latest group of surrendering German soldiers were 7 boys who looked like they should have been in school, not in Wehrmacht uniforms. The youngest appeared to be no more than 12 years old, his oversized helmet sliding down over eyes that held nothing but terror. These were not hardened SS fanatics or experienced soldiers. They were children who had been handed rifles in the desperate final months of the Third Reich and told to die for a country that was already dead. Captain Daniel Morrison stood in his office reviewing the intake documents with growing discomfort. 7 juveniles, the report read, ages estimated between 12 and 16, captured during the retreat from Mannheim, armed and in military uniform. The legal designation was clear. They were enemy combatants, prisoners of war subject to standard protocols. But the reality standing in his detention yard was something else entirely. They were terrified children who flinched at every sudden movement, who had clearly expected to be executed the moment they surrendered. In the camp's mess hall, Sergeant Frank Kowalski was preparing the evening meal for the American troops when Lieutenant Parker entered with an unusual request. "We need rations for 7 more," he said quietly. "The new prisoners." Kowalski had been a mess sergeant for 3 years, feeding soldiers in North Africa, Italy, and now Germany. He had seen plenty of German prisoners pass through various camps, but when Parker mentioned they were children, something shifted in the veteran sergeant's expression. His own son David was 19, fighting with the Marines somewhere in the Pacific. The thought of enemy soldiers barely into their teens stirred something paternal that overrode years of military detachment. "How young?" Kowalski asked, his hands pausing over the potatoes he had been peeling. "The youngest might be 12, Parker replied. "They are scared out of their minds. Think we are going to shoot them." The mess hall fell silent except for the bubbling of pots on the stove. Kowalski looked at the evening's menu: pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. It was a good meal, the kind that reminded soldiers they were still human beings despite the war. The kind of meal that said you mattered, that someone cared whether you lived or died. Without asking permission, without consulting regulations or protocols, Sergeant Kowalski made a decision that would be remembered long after the war ended. He began preparing 7 full plates of the same food his own troops would eat. Not prisoner rations, not the minimal sustenance required by the Geneva Convention, but real food served with the same care he would show to any hungry child. When Lieutenant Parker saw what the sergeant was doing, he started to object, then stopped. Sometimes, Parker realized, mercy mattered more than regulations. Sometimes feeding a terrified child was more important than maintaining the proper distance between captor and captive. The 7 boys sat in a tight cluster in the detention yard, their backs against the wooden fence as if trying to disappear into it. They wore fragments of German military uniforms, some several sizes too large, others patched with civilian clothing underneath. Their faces were smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but it was their eyes that told the real story. These were not the eyes of soldiers. They were the eyes of children who had seen too much, endured too much, and expected nothing but death. Klaus Richter was the smallest, barely reaching 4.5 feet tall. He clutched a dented canteen that he refused to let go of, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The helmet on his head was comically oversized, meant for a full-grown man. He came from Berlin, though the city he remembered no longer existed. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. His mother and sister had died in a bombing raid 6 months ago. At 12 years old, Klaus had been alone in the world when the Hitler Youth organizers came to his bombed-out neighborhood looking for recruits. They had not asked if he wanted to serve. They had simply handed him a uniform and told him it was his duty. Dieter Lehmann sat beside him, 14 years old, and trying desperately to maintain some semblance of military bearing even in captivity. He had been a squad leader in the Hitler Youth, one of those boys who had believed every word of the propaganda that had been fed to him since he was 8. His father was a party official in Stuttgart, a true believer who had sent his son off to fight with pride. Dieter had commanded younger boys in his unit, leading them in exercises and drills, teaching them to worship the Führer and hate the enemies of Germany. Now, sitting in an American prison yard, he was beginning to understand that everything he had been taught might have been a lie. Friedrich Vogel, who everyone called Fritz, was 15 and came from Munich. Unlike Dieter, he had never believed in the cause. He had joined the Hitler Youth because refusing meant punishment for his entire family. His father was a musician, his mother a seamstress. They were ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary madness. Fritz had been drafted into military service in February, when the German army was scraping the bottom of the barrel for anyone who could hold a rifle. He had been in uniform for exactly 63 days before surrendering to American forces, and every one of those days had been a waking nightmare. Hans Becker was the oldest at 16, tall and lean, with the beginning of what might have become a man's frame if starvation and war had not hollowed him out. He came from Hamburg, or what remained of it, after Allied firebombing had turned the city into an inferno. His 3 younger brothers had all been killed in different ways, one in bombing, one from disease in the chaos of refugee movements, one simply disappeared and never found. The boys had been taught exactly what to expect from American soldiers. Their training instructors, many of them fanatical SS officers, had shown them propaganda films depicting Americans as savage monsters who tortured prisoners and committed unspeakable atrocities. The younger boys, like Klaus and Werner, had been specifically warned that the Americans showed no mercy to children, that they would be killed immediately upon capture. This indoctrination had been reinforced by stories whispered among retreating German troops, tales designed to make soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender. When American infantry had overrun their position outside Mannheim, Klaus had closed his eyes and waited for the gunshot he was certain would come. Instead, a young American corporal had pulled the rifle from his trembling hands and said something in English that Klaus could not understand. The tone had been firm, but not cruel. When Klaus had finally opened his eyes, he saw not a monster but a tired young man who looked barely older than Hans. The corporal had searched him for weapons with quick efficiency, then moved on to the next prisoner. No beatings, no executions, just the mechanical process of disarming enemy combatants. But the fear had not left them. During the truck ride to the processing camp, the boys had sat in tense silence, each convinced that the Americans were simply transporting them to a more convenient location for killing them. Werner Schmidt, 13 years old and orphaned, had whispered prayers under his breath in German. Otto Klein had gripped Fritz's hand so tightly that his fingernails left marks. Josef Wagner, the 15-year-old farm boy, had vomited twice from sheer terror, apologizing in German to the American guards who obviously could not understand him. The processing had been bewildering. American soldiers had photographed them, taken their names and ages, and examined them for wounds or illness. Dr. Green, the camp medical officer, had checked each boy with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. He had treated an infected cut on Dieter's arm, given Werner medication for a persistent cough, and spoken to them in a calm voice, even though they understood none of his words. The contradiction between what they had been taught to expect and what was actually happening created a cognitive dissonance that left them more frightened than ever. Now, sitting in the detention yard as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, they waited. Hans, the oldest, tried to comfort the younger boys by telling them that if the Americans had wanted to kill them, they would have done it already. But even he did not fully believe his own words. Dieter sat rigid with military discipline, determined to face death with the courage he had been taught to display. Frank Kowalski had joined the Army in 1942 at the age of 38. older than most recruits but driven by a sense of duty that would not let him sit out the war. He had grown up in a Polish immigrant neighborhood in Chicago, the son of parents who had fled Europe to give their children better lives. His father had worked in the stockyards, his mother had cleaned houses, and they had instilled in their son a bone-deep understanding of what it meant to be hungry, to be displaced, to be at the mercy of forces beyond your control. Before the war, Kowalski had been a cook at a small restaurant on the South Side. He understood food not just as fuel, but as an expression of care, a way of saying you matter without needing words to convey it. When he had been assigned to mess duty in the Army, some soldiers had joked that he had gotten an easy posting. But Kowalski took the work seriously. He remembered every face that came through his line, noticed which men were losing too much weight, which ones were struggling with the mental toll of combat. Feeding soldiers was not just logistics. It was a small way of maintaining their humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. His son David had enlisted in the Marines right after Pearl Harbor, eager and proud and terrifyingly young. Kowalski had stood on the platform at Union Station and watched his boy disappear into the crowd of uniformed men heading west toward the Pacific Theater. Every day since then had been shadowed by the fear that a telegram would arrive with news that would destroy his world. He and his wife Margaret wrote to David constantly, sending packages of cookies and socks and anything else they thought might remind him of home. They had not heard from him in 6 weeks, and the silence was agony. When Lieutenant Parker had told him about the 7 boys in the detention yard, Kowalski's first thought had been of David. Somewhere in the Pacific, his son was fighting against Japanese soldiers, some of whom were probably teenagers themselves. War had a way of devouring the young, grinding them up without regard for their age or their innocence. These German boys were the enemy, yes. They had worn the uniform of a regime that had brought unspeakable evil into the world. But they were also somebody's sons, and they were children. The regulations were clear about prisoner rations, adequate nutrition, sufficient calories to maintain health, nothing more. The Geneva Convention specified minimum standards, and the Army followed them precisely. But as Kowalski looked at the 7 full plates he had prepared, he thought about what his own mother would have done if she had encountered hungry children, regardless of what flag they had fought under. Sergeant Kowalski carried the tray himself, refusing offers of help from the younger soldiers who watched with mixed expressions of confusion and disapproval. The detention yard was quiet when he entered, escorted by Corporal O'Brien, who kept one hand near his sidearm out of protocol rather than genuine concern. 7 pairs of eyes tracked Kowalski's movement with the wariness of animals who had learned that humans brought pain more often than comfort. The sergeant set the tray down on a wooden table that had been placed in the yard and stepped back, gesturing toward the food. The boys did not move. They remained frozen against the fence, their bodies tense with suspicion. Klaus stared at the plates with an expression that mixed desperate hunger with absolute terror. The smell of the pork chops reached them, rich and impossibly enticing, after weeks of near-starvation rations in the collapsing German army. Werner's stomach growled audibly, and he pressed his hand against it, as if trying to silence the betrayal of his own body's needs. Dieter spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper in German, as if vergiftet. "It is poisoned." The other boys nodded, their indoctrination providing explanations for this apparent kindness. Why else would the Americans feed them well, except to kill them more slowly, more cruelly? Hans added his own theory in German, suggesting that perhaps they were being fattened up for some propaganda purpose, to be photographed and displayed as evidence of American mercy before being disposed of. Kowalski did not speak German, but he understood fear in any language. He had seen it in the eyes of Italian civilians when American troops first entered their villages, in the faces of French children who had learned to distrust anyone in uniform. Without saying a word, the sergeant picked up one of the plates, cut a piece of pork chop with the provided fork and ate it himself. He chewed slowly, deliberately, then swallowed and smiled. He gestured again to the remaining plates, then stepped further back to give them space. The silence stretched for nearly 2 minutes. Then Joseph, the farm boy whose body was consuming itself from hunger, stood up slowly. His legs shook from a combination of weakness and fear as he approached the table. He picked up a plate with trembling hands, looked back at the other boys, then looked at Kowalski. The sergeant nodded encouragingly. Joseph sat down on the ground right there, unable to wait long enough to return to the fence, and took his first bite. The transformation on his face was immediate and heartbreaking. The pork chop was perfectly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper, still warm from the kitchen. For a boy who had been eating whatever scraps he could find for months, who had watched friends die from starvation and disease, this simple meal was almost too much to comprehend. Tears began streaming down Joseph's face as he chewed, and he did not bother to wipe them away. He was crying and eating simultaneously, his body overwhelmed by the sudden kindness. One by one, the other boys approached the table. Their boys. Werner came next, then Fritz, then Otto. Even Dieter, who had held onto his military bearing and suspicion longer than the others, eventually stood and walked forward. Hans helped Klaus carry his plate back to the fence, the older boy's protective instinct overriding his own hunger for a moment. They ate in silence, the only sounds their chewing and occasional suppressed sobs as their bodies received real nutrition for the first time in longer than most of them could remember. The plates were empty within 10 minutes, scraped clean by boys who had learned not to waste a single morsel of food. Klaus had eaten every green bean, soaked up the meat juices with his bread, and licked his fork until it shined. Now the boys sat with the unfamiliar sensation of fullness in their bellies, and for the first time since their capture, the absolute certainty of imminent death had faded slightly. They were still afraid, still uncertain, but the simple act of being fed had created a small crack in the wall of terror that had surrounded them. Corporal Michael O'Brien, the young guard from Boston who had been watching the entire scene, approached the boys slowly. He was 20 years old, fresh-faced, and far from home himself, and he carried in his pocket a photograph of his 2 younger brothers. Looking at these German prisoners, he could not help but see reflections of the boys he had left behind in Massachusetts. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Michael." Then he pointed to Klaus and raised his eyebrows in a universal question. Klaus hesitated, glanced at Hans for guidance, then whispered his name, Klaus. Michael smiled and repeated it, his pronunciation clumsy but earnest. He moved to the next boy, and Werner gave his name, then Fritz, then Joseph, then Otto, then Dieter, and finally Hans. Michael repeated each name, committing them to memory, treating each introduction as if it mattered. In that moment, they stopped being anonymous enemy prisoners and became individuals with identities, with names that deserved to be spoken correctly. Private Thomas Henderson joined O'Brien in the yard. He was a farm boy from Iowa who had grown up raising pigs and cattle, and he understood the language of care that transcended words. He noticed that Klaus was shivering, despite the mild evening temperature, his too large uniform providing little warmth. Without asking permission, Henderson disappeared and returned 5 minutes later with several wool blankets from the supply room. He handed one to each boy, showing them how to wrap it around their shoulders. The boys accepted the blankets with mumbled words in German that Henderson could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. "Thank you." They pulled the rough wool tight around themselves, and for the first time in the detention yard, their postures began to relax slightly. Otto, the 14-year-old from Bavaria, touched the blanket fabric with something approaching wonder. He had not been warm in months. Sergeant Kowalski returned to collect the empty plates and paused when he saw the transformation in the yard. The boys were still frightened, still uncertain, but they were no longer cowering against the fence like animals awaiting slaughter. They were sitting with blankets around their shoulders, their basic needs met, their immediate terror diminished. Hans was speaking quietly to Klaus in German, pointing at the Americans and saying words that Kowalski could not understand, but whose tone suggested he was revising his earlier assumptions about their captors. As darkness began to fall, Captain Morrison arrived to assess the situation. He had been prepared to find a tense standoff, frightened prisoners and frustrated guards struggling to communicate across the barriers of language and enmity. Instead, he found something that looked almost peaceful. Klaus Richter had turned 12 years old on March 15, 1945, exactly 39 days before his capture. There had been no celebration, no cake, no gathering of family because his family no longer existed. He had marked the occasion alone in the rubble of what had once been a school building in eastern Berlin, listening to the distant thunder of Soviet artillery growing closer each day. The canteen he still clutched had belonged to his father, a postal worker who had been conscripted in 1942 and sent to the Eastern Front. It was the only physical object Klaus had left from his previous life. His mother, Eva, had been a seamstress who took in work to support Klaus and his younger sister Anna after their father left for war. She had tried to maintain normalcy for her children even as Berlin descended into chaos, even as food became scarce and the bombing raids grew more frequent. Klaus remembered her singing while she worked, remembered the way she would save tiny portions of her own meals to make sure he and Anna had enough to eat. She had died on November 3, 1944, when a British bombing raid struck their apartment building. Anna, only 8 years old, had been killed in the same explosion. Klaus had been at a Hitler Youth meeting when the bombs fell. He had returned to find nothing but rubble where his home had stood. Neighbors told him that his mother and sister were gone, buried somewhere in the collapsed building that would never be excavated because Berlin had too many ruins and too few living people to care for the dead. He had stood in the street holding his father's canteen, the only possession he had grabbed that morning, and understood that he was completely alone in the world. The Hitler Youth leaders had found him 3 days later, sleeping in a burnt-out tram car and surviving on scraps scavenged from abandoned buildings. They had taken him to a collection center where dozens of other orphaned boys were being processed. Some were younger than Klaus, some older, all of them hollow-eyed and lost. The leaders had given them speeches about duty and honor, about serving the fatherland in its hour of greatest need. But Klaus had not joined because of ideology. He had joined because the alternative was starving to death alone in the ruins. The training had been brief and brutal. 2 weeks of learning to march, to salute, to handle a rifle that was taller than he was. The instructors had been old men and wounded veterans, the only soldiers Germany could spare for training children. They had taught the boys to dig trenches, to recognize enemy aircraft, to throw grenades that were terrifyingly heavy in small hands. They had shown them propaganda films about American and Soviet atrocities, about the fate that awaited Germany if the enemies won. Fight to the death, they had been told. Surrender means torture and execution. Klaus had been assigned to a Volkssturm unit, the people's militia that represented Germany's final desperate attempt to defend itself with whoever remained. His unit had consisted of boys between 12 and 16, old men over 60, and a handful of wounded soldiers who had been deemed fit enough for this last stand. Their weapons were a mixture of outdated rifles, weapons captured from defeated enemies, and improvised explosives. The winter of 1944 to 45 had transformed Germany's children into soldiers out of sheer desperation. As the Reich's territory shrank and its armies bled out on multiple fronts, the Nazi leadership had turned to the only untapped resource remaining, the young and the old. The Hitler Youth, which had begun as an indoctrination organization teaching boys patriotism and physical fitness, became a recruiting ground for child soldiers needed to fill gaps in collapsing defensive lines. Dieter Lehmann had been 15 when he received his call-up notice in January. Unlike Klaus, Dieter had not been an orphan forced into service by circumstance. His father, Ernst Lehmann, had been a mid-level Nazi Party official in Stuttgart who genuinely believed in the ideology he served. When Dieter's conscription papers arrived, his father had shaken his hand with pride and told him that serving the fatherland was the highest honor a German boy could achieve. His mother had cried quietly but said nothing that might contradict her husband's enthusiasm. Dieter had been a model Hitler Youth member since age 10. He had memorized the speeches, learned the songs, participated enthusiastically in the camping trips and athletic competitions that were designed to prepare boys for military service. He had believed every word about German superiority, about the necessity of defending the homeland against inferior enemies who sought to destroy their way of life. When he put on his uniform for the first time as an actual soldier rather than a youth organization member, he had felt pride. That pride had lasted approximately 3 weeks, until his unit was sent to help defend a bridge crossing outside Karlsruhe. The reality of combat bore no resemblance to the glorious propaganda films he had watched. There was nothing noble about cowering in a frozen trench while artillery shells screamed overhead. There was nothing heroic about watching boys he had known since childhood get torn apart by machine gun fire. The older soldiers in his unit, veterans of the Eastern Front, had looked at the child reinforcements with a mixture of pity and disgust. Fritz Vogel's path to military service had been different but equally inevitable. His father, a cellist in the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra, had kept his family away from Nazi Party activities as much as possible without attracting dangerous attention. But by late 1944, there was no avoiding the conscription of every male capable of holding a weapon. Fritz had received his papers in February, and his father had held him tightly the night before he left, whispering apologies that Fritz did not fully understand until later. The training facility where Fritz was sent processed boys in batches of 50, giving them abbreviated instruction before shipping them to wherever the front lines needed bodies. The instructors had stopped pretending these children would become real soldiers. They taught only the basics: how to load and fire a rifle, how to identify enemy uniforms, how to dig a fighting position. The more complex aspects of military training were abandoned as luxuries Germany could no longer afford. Hans Becker had been 16 when Hamburg burned. The firebombing campaign of July 1943 had killed an estimated 42,000 people in a single week, turning Germany's second-largest city into an inferno that created its own weather system. Hans had survived in a basement shelter while the world above became hell, emerging to find his neighborhood erased and 2 of his 3 brothers dead. The boys had not spoken about what they had witnessed during their brief time as soldiers. Some experiences were too terrible to put into words, even among those who had shared them. But in the detention yard, as the evening darkness deepened and the American guards maintained their respectful distance, the walls that had kept those memories locked away began to crack. It started with Werner, the 13-year-old orphan whose persistent cough Dr. Green had treated with medicine that actually worked. Werner had been assigned to a unit defending a small town whose name he could no longer remember. The civilians had already fled, leaving behind empty houses and a church with its steeple blown off by earlier shelling. His commanding officer had been a 48-year-old schoolteacher who had never fired a weapon in combat before being handed a rifle and a squad of children to lead. When American tanks appeared on the road leading into town, the officer had ordered them to hold their positions and fight. The battle had lasted less than an hour. Werner had fired his rifle 3 times, aiming at shapes moving between buildings, never knowing if his bullets hit anything or anyone. The American return fire had been overwhelming, professional, the product of soldiers who actually knew what they were doing. Werner's officer had been killed in the first minutes. The boy next to Werner, a 14-year-old named Paul, had been hit in the chest and died crying for his mother while Werner held his hand and had no idea how to help him. When the Americans had finally overrun their position, Werner had been hiding in a cellar with 4 other boys. They had emerged with their hands raised, expecting execution, and instead had been given water and basic medical attention. Paul's body had been left in the street where he fell, and Werner had not been allowed to stay with him or even learn where he would be buried. That abandonment haunted him more than the death itself. Otto Klein's experience had been different, but equally traumatic. He had been part of a unit tasked with defending a railway junction that had already been bombed into uselessness. There had been no strategic value to their position, but orders were orders, and by April of 1945, the German military command structure had descended into chaos where meaningless defensive stands were ordered simply because surrendering was unthinkable to the fanatics still in charge. Otto had watched older soldiers desert in the night, slipping away toward homes and families they hoped still existed. The officers who remained had threatened to shoot deserters, but there were too few officers and too many desperate men for the threats to mean anything. Otto had stayed not out of loyalty, but because he had nowhere else to go. His family's farm in Bavaria had been in the path of the American advance, and he had no idea if his parents and siblings were alive or dead. The surrender had come when their position was surrounded and their ammunition was nearly gone. A German lieutenant, barely 23 years old, had made the decision to raise a white flag, despite knowing it could be considered treason. The International Red Cross maintained lists of displaced persons, refugees, and casualties throughout occupied Europe. It was an overwhelming task made nearly impossible by the scale of destruction and chaos. Millions of people had been uprooted, killed, or scattered across a continent that had torn itself apart. The organization did its best to reunite families and provide information about the fate of missing loved ones, but the requests far exceeded their capacity to respond. Captain Morrison had contacted the Red Cross on behalf of the 7 boys, providing their names, ages, and last known addresses of their families. The responses, when they came, were devastating in their brevity. Klaus Richter. Family residence in Berlin destroyed, no surviving relatives located. Werner Schmidt. Parents confirmed deceased in bombing raid, no other family found. Otto Klein. Family farm in American-occupied zone, status unknown, investigation ongoing. Josef Wagner. No information available. The replies for Dieter, Fritz, and Hans were similarly bleak. The Germany these boys had left behind had been consumed by the war, and the people they loved were scattered, dead, or impossible to locate. Klaus had not expected any different news about his family. He had watched them die, had lived through months knowing he was alone, but seeing it written in official Red Cross documentation made it feel permanent in a way that his own memories had not. He held the letter that Captain Morrison had translated for him, staring at the words that confirmed what his heart already knew. There was no home to return to. There was no family waiting for him. If he went back to Germany, he would be a 12-year-old child entirely on his own in a defeated, devastated country. Werner's reaction to his Red Cross letter was different. He had held on to hope that perhaps his parents had survived, that maybe the reports of their deaths had been mistakes or confusion in the chaos of war. When Captain Morrison told him gently that the Red Cross had confirmed both parents were killed in the same bombing raid that had orphaned him, Werner had simply nodded. He did not cry. He had no tears left. He just folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket as if it were something precious rather than the document that destroyed his last hope. For Hans, the news was mixed and somehow worse than simple confirmation of death. His family home in Hamburg had been destroyed, but Red Cross records showed that one of his brothers, the youngest, might have survived and been evacuated with other children to the countryside. might have survived. The uncertainty was torture. Hans now faced an impossible question. If he returned to Germany, should he spend months or years searching for a brother who might not exist, who might have died despite the uncertain records, who might not even remember Hans after years of separation? Dieter's letter brought news that struck differently than the others. His father, the Nazi Party official, was alive and in American custody, being held for potential war crimes prosecution. His mother was living with relatives in the countryside, surviving but struggling. The days following the Red Cross letters brought a subtle shift in the detention yard's atmosphere. The boys were no longer just waiting to be processed and sent somewhere else. They were waiting for decisions that would determine the rest of their lives. In that limbo, the boundaries between prisoners and guards continued to blur in ways that would have been unthinkable in a conventional military setting. The American soldiers, most of them barely older than the boys they guarded, began treating their charges less like enemy combatants and more like younger brothers who needed protection. Private Henderson, the Iowa farm boy, had taken a particular interest in Joseph, recognizing in the 15-year-old something of his own rural background. Joseph had grown up working his family's small farm near the Austrian border, rising before dawn to milk cows and tend fields. Henderson had done the same on his family's property outside Des Moines. One afternoon, Henderson brought photographs from home showing Joseph pictures of his own farm, his parents standing proudly in front of their barn, his younger sister feeding chickens. Joseph studied the photographs with intense concentration, pointing to the cows and saying the German word Kuhe. Henderson repeated it, then said cows in English. They went through the photographs together, trading words for barn, field, tractor, horse, each finding comfort in the universal language of agricultural life. For half an hour, the war disappeared, and they were just two farm boys comparing notes about a way of life they both understood and missed desperately. Corporal O'Brien had similarly connected with Klaus, perhaps because the 12-year-old's vulnerability reminded him of his own younger brothers back in Boston. O'Brien had started teaching Klaus basic English phrases using simple objects around the camp as teaching tools. He would point to a cup and say, cup, then have Klaus repeat it. Point to the sky and say, sky. Point to his own chest and say, friend. The word friend made Klaus pause, his expression uncertain, as if he could not quite believe that an American soldier would use that word for a German prisoner. The teaching sessions expanded to include the other boys. Sergeant Kowalski joined in, bringing food vocabulary into the lessons. He would hold up an apple and say the English word, then ask the boys for the German. They learned bread, water, potato, meat. Each word was a small bridge across the chasm of language and enmity. Hans, the oldest and quickest with languages, became an informal assistant teacher, helping translate Kowalski's instructions for the younger boys who struggled more with English. Dr. Green conducted daily medical checks that went beyond strict necessity. He treated Werner's cough with patience and care, showing him how to use an inhaler and explaining through gestures and simple words that his lungs had been damaged by cold and malnutrition, but would heal with time and proper treatment. He checked the healing cut on Dieter's arm, rewrapping it with clean bandages and giving him extra rations to help his body fight the infection. The photographs arrived in mid-May, brought by a military intelligence officer who was documenting evidence of Nazi atrocities for eventual war crimes tribunals. Captain Morrison had not wanted to show them to the boys, had argued that children should not be exposed to such horrors. But the intelligence officer had insisted that all German prisoners, regardless of age, needed to confront what their country had done. The images were from Dachau, liberated by American forces just weeks earlier. They showed the things that nightmares were made of, the evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Captain Morrison gathered the 7 boys in a small room and explained through Hans's growing English skills what they were about to see. He told them that these photographs were real, that they documented camps that existed throughout Germany and Poland, that millions of people had been murdered in these places. He watched the boys' faces as they processed this information, saw confusion and disbelief, and the beginning of a horror that would mark them forever. Klaus looked at the first photograph and did not understand what he was seeing. The images were of people so starved they barely looked human anymore, of bodies stacked like cordwood, of children behind barbed wire who looked even younger than he was. He turned to Hans and asked in German if this was real or if it was propaganda meant to make them feel guilty. Hans did not answer because he did not know. Dieter's reaction was immediate denial. He insisted loudly in German that these were fake, that the Americans had created these images to justify their invasion, that his father had told him the enemy spread lies about Germany to turn the world against them. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. The photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too horrifyingly consistent to be fabrications. Captain Morrison showed them documents, showed them testimony from German guards who had been captured, showed them the evidence that could not be explained away. Fritz felt physically ill. He left the room twice to vomit, his body rejecting not just the images, but everything they meant about his country and his own complicity. He had worn the uniform. He had served the regime that built these camps. It did not matter that he had not known they existed, that he had never participated in their operation. He had been part of the machine that made them possible, and that knowledge was unbearable. Werner stared at a photograph of children in striped uniforms, children who looked like they might have been his classmates or neighbors. He thought about his own suffering, his own hunger and fear, and realized it was nothing compared to what these people had endured. He had complained about being cold and scared. These children had been systematically starved and murdered. The scale of the difference made his own trauma feel almost shameful by comparison. December arrived with unexpected coldness, bringing the first real winter weather to the region and a reminder that the boys had now been in American custody for more than 7 months. The war in the Pacific had ended in August, after atomic bombs devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sergeant Kowalski had received a letter from his son David, who had survived the fighting and was stationed in occupied Japan. The relief in the mess sergeant's eyes was visible to everyone who knew him. His boy was coming home alive. For the German boys, the passage of time had been disorienting. They were no longer technically prisoners of war since Germany had surrendered, but their legal status remained uncertain. They were classified as displaced persons under American military custody, waiting for decisions about their futures that seemed to take forever. Captain Morrison had been working with military authorities and relief organizations to determine what could be done with 7 German youths who had no families to return to and no clear path forward. The approaching Christmas holiday presented Captain Morrison with a dilemma similar to the one Captain Sullivan had faced with the German women prisoners the previous year. How do you celebrate a Christian holiday with enemy nationals who were still essentially in captivity? He consulted with Father Schuller, the German-American chaplain who had been visiting the camp regularly to provide spiritual guidance to the boys. Father Schuller suggested that the holiday might offer an opportunity for healing, a chance to demonstrate to the boys that they were valued as human beings despite their past affiliations. He proposed a modest celebration that would include the boys in Christmas traditions while respecting the complex emotions that the season would inevitably bring. Captain Morrison agreed, authorizing the use of camp resources for decorations and a special holiday meal. The preparations began in mid-December. Corporal O'Brien and Private Henderson worked with the boys to create decorations from whatever materials they could find. Klaus showed surprising artistic talent, drawing and cutting out paper snowflakes with meticulous care. Josef and Otto helped string lights in the common room where they spent their evenings. Werner still fighting his persistent cough despite months of treatment, painted pine cones with white paint to look like they were covered in snow. Sergeant Kowalski planned a Christmas feast that would rival anything he had cooked during his time in the Army. He requisitioned a turkey, real potatoes, fresh vegetables, and ingredients for pie. He enlisted the boys' help in the kitchen, teaching them American cooking techniques while learning from them about German Christmas traditions. Hans explained about Stollen, the traditional Christmas bread. Dieter, slowly emerging from the depression that had gripped him since seeing the concentration camp photographs, told them about Lebkuchen cookies his mother used to make. The legal questions surrounding the 7 boys had occupied military lawyers and State Department officials for months. The situation was unprecedented in several ways. They were minors who had been armed combatants but had not committed any specific war crimes. They were German nationals with no families to return to and no viable means of supporting themselves if repatriated. They had been captured in uniform, but were children who had been conscripted rather than volunteers in any meaningful sense. Every aspect of their case existed in gray areas that military regulations had not anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Walsh arrived at the camp in early January to review the cases personally. He was a military lawyer who had been tasked with establishing precedents for handling the thousands of German youth who had been pressed into service during the war's final months. Some were being processed through juvenile detention facilities in Germany. Others were being returned to whatever remained of their families. But cases like these 7, where the boys were orphaned and had formed attachments to their American captors, required different solutions. Walsh interviewed each boy separately, using Hans as a translator for the younger ones, whose English remained limited. He asked them about their service, their capture, their feelings about returning to Germany. Klaus told him plainly that he had nothing to return to, no family, no home, no future he could imagine, in the ruins of his country. Werner said similar things, his voice flat with acceptance of his situation. Josef explained that even if his family's farm still existed, he had no way of knowing if his parents were alive or if he could survive the journey to reach them. The interviews with Dieter and Fritz were more complicated. Dieter's father was alive, but facing war crimes charges for his role in Nazi Party activities. Dieter confessed to Colonel Walsh that he no longer knew how to feel about his father. He had been raised to worship the man, to see him as a representative of everything strong and good about Germany. Now he understood that his father had been part of a criminal regime, and the thought of facing him again filled Dieter with shame and confusion. Fritz's situation was different. The Red Cross had finally located his parents, living in the American occupation zone and desperately searching for their son. They had written letters expressing their joy that Fritz was alive and their desire to be reunited with him. But Fritz found himself uncertain whether he wanted to return. He had changed during his months in American custody. The boy who had left Munich was not the same person who would return. He feared disappointing his parents, feared that they would see in him someone they no longer recognized. Colonel Walsh's report to his superiors outlined the complexity of the situation and recommended an unprecedented solution. The boys should be offered a choice: voluntary repatriation to Germany with assistance finding housing and employment, or sponsored immigration to the United States under a special displaced persons provision. The recommendation was controversial, immediately generating debate among military officials and State Department bureaucrats. The announcement came in February of 1946, nearly 10 months after the boys' initial capture. Captain Morrison gathered them in the common room where they had celebrated Christmas together, and explained the decision that had finally been reached. Through Hans's translation for the younger boys, he told them they had a choice to make. They could return to Germany, where the American military government would help place them in orphanages or apprenticeship programs, depending on their ages. Or they could apply for special immigration status to remain in the United States. provided they could find American families willing to sponsor them. The room fell silent as the boys processed this information. Klaus looked at Corporal O'Brien, who had become like a brother to him over the past months. Werner stared at his hands. His persistent cough finally healed after months of Dr. Green's patient treatment. Joseph thought about Private Henderson's farm photographs, about the life he had lost, and the possibility of building something similar in America. Hans felt the weight of being the oldest, knowing that his decision would influence the younger boys who looked to him for guidance. Captain Morrison continued, explaining that the choice was theirs to make individually. Some could choose to stay, while others chose to return. There was no pressure either way, no right or wrong answer. He told them honestly about the challenges they would face in America, learning English fluently, adapting to a foreign culture, living with the knowledge that many Americans would always see them as former enemies. But he also told them about the opportunities, education, jobs, the chance to build lives in a country that had not been bombed into ruins. Dieter spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. He wanted to return to Germany, not to reunite with his father, who he might never be able to forgive, but because he felt a responsibility to help rebuild the country that had been destroyed, partly by people like his father. He had been indoctrinated into believing Germany was superior. Now he wanted to return to help create a Germany that would never again embrace such evil. He wanted to be part of ensuring that what had happened in those camps could never happen again. Fritz had reached a different decision. He wanted to return to his parents. They had written him 5 letters, each one expressing their love and their desperate desire to see him again. His mother had explained that she and his father had opposed the Nazis quietly, had never believed in the ideology, but had been too afraid to resist openly. Fritz believed her. He wanted to go home to them, to help them rebuild their lives, to become the family they had been before the war tore everything apart. The younger boys struggled more with the decision. Klaus, Werner, Josef, and Otto had no families pulling them back to Germany. For them, the choice was between returning to a country that held nothing but traumatic memories or staying in America with people who had shown them unexpected kindness. The repatriation transport left in early March carrying Dieter, Fritz, and Hans back to a Germany they barely recognized. Hans had ultimately chosen to return, driven by the slim possibility that his youngest brother might still be alive somewhere in the chaos of displaced persons camps. The 3 boys stood at the rail of the ship as it pulled away from the New York harbor, watching the American coastline recede. Behind them in the camp they were leaving, Klaus, Werner, Josef, and Otto remained, having chosen to accept the uncertain future of immigration rather than return to certain devastation. The journey across the Atlantic took 9 days, and the ship carried hundreds of displaced persons returning to Europe. Some were former prisoners of war, others were refugees who had fled Nazi persecution and were now returning to search for surviving family members. Dieter, Fritz, and Hans shared a small cabin, spending the voyage in quiet conversation about what awaited them. They had been given documents identifying them as displaced persons under American military authority, along with letters of introduction to relief organizations in Germany. The ship docked at Bremerhaven, a port city that had been bombed repeatedly during the war. The destruction was immediately visible from the ship, entire blocks reduced to rubble, buildings standing like broken teeth against the sky, people moving through the ruins with the exhausted determination of survivors. This was the Germany they had returned to, a country that bore little resemblance to the one they had left less than a year ago. Fritz's parents were waiting for him at the processing center, having traveled from Munich to meet him. His mother looked years older than he remembered, her hair gone gray, her face lined with worry and hunger. But when she saw Fritz walking through the crowd of returning displaced persons, her face transformed with joy. She ran to him, embracing him with a strength that surprised them both. His father stood back, tears streaming down his face, waiting his turn to hold his son. They stood together for a long time, a small family reunited in the midst of national catastrophe. Dieter's reunion was more difficult. His father was still in custody, awaiting trial for his role in Nazi Party activities. His mother met Dieter at the station, but their embrace was stiff and awkward. She looked at her son and saw a stranger, someone who had experienced things she could not imagine. He looked at her and saw someone who had stood by while his father committed evil, who had benefited from the regime's crimes even if she had not committed them herself. They traveled together to his aunt's house in the countryside, making small talk about trivial things because neither could find words for what truly mattered. Hans began his search for his brother immediately, registering with every displaced persons organization and refugee service he could find. He showed photographs, described his brother's age and appearance, filled out forms in triplicate at offices throughout the American occupation zone. Klaus Richter was adopted by the O'Brien family in the summer of 1946. Corporal Michael O'Brien had returned to Boston with his military discharge papers and immediately begun the process of sponsoring Klaus for immigration. His parents, Irish immigrants themselves, who understood what it meant to start over in a foreign country, had welcomed the idea of taking in the German boy their son had written about in letters home. Klaus arrived in Boston on a humid July day, carrying a small suitcase containing everything he owned and still clutching his father's canteen. The transition was not easy. Klaus spoke limited English and struggled in school with children who whispered about him being a Nazi. The O'Brien family enrolled him in Catholic school where the nuns were strict but kind, where his accent marked him as different but not necessarily enemy. He had nightmares about Berlin, about watching his apartment building collapse, about the fear in the detention yard before Sergeant Kowalski brought the pork chops. Mrs. O'Brien would hear him crying at night and sit with him, speaking softly, even though he could not always understand her words. Werner Schmidt had been sponsored by Dr. Green, who had recognized something in the boy during those months of treating his persistent cough. The doctor and his wife had no children of their own, and they saw in Werner an opportunity to make a real difference in one young life. They brought him to their home in Pennsylvania, enrolled him in high school, and watched with quiet pride as he excelled in science classes. Werner wanted to become a doctor himself, wanted to heal people the way Dr. Green had healed him. Joseph Wagner found his new home with the Henderson family in Iowa. Private Thomas Henderson's parents had a large farm and remembered what it was like to need help during the Depression. Joseph worked alongside Henderson's father in the fields, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of agricultural life. The cows were different breeds than the ones he had known in Bavaria. The crops were planted on a different schedule, but the fundamental connection to the land was the same. He wrote letters to his parents' last known address, hoping against hope they might somehow reach them, but no replies ever came. Otto Klein was sponsored by Father Schuller's parish in Worcester, Massachusetts. The church community took turns hosting him, teaching him English, helping him find work as an apprentice mechanic. Otto discovered he had a talent for fixing things, for understanding how machines worked. By 1948, he was running his own small repair shop, serving a community that had learned to see him as one of their own rather than as a former enemy. The four boys stayed in contact through letters, creating a network of shared experience that helped them navigate their new lives. They wrote about their struggles with English, about the Americans who treated them with suspicion, about the moments of unexpected kindness that reminded them why they had chosen to stay. 63 years later, in the spring of 2008, Klaus Richter O'Brien stood in the lobby of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He was 75 years old, a retired school teacher with grown children and grandchildren who knew him only as their kind, slightly accented grandfather. He had been invited to speak at a symposium about reconciliation and the treatment of enemy prisoners during the war. Standing beside him was Joseph Wagner Henderson, also 75, his hands still strong from decades of farm work. They had come to tell their story, to explain to a new generation what it meant to receive mercy when you expected death. Klaus spoke first, his English now flawless after 6 decades in America, but still carrying the faint melody of his German origins. He told the audience about being 12 years old and terrified, about expecting execution and receiving pork chops instead. His voice broke slightly when he described Sergeant Kowalski, who had died in 1972, but whose simple act of feeding hungry children had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Joseph talked about Private Henderson, about seeing photographs of an Iowa farm and recognizing that people on both sides of the war were fundamentally the same. He explained how his sponsor family had given him not just a home, but a second chance at the life the war had stolen from him. He had married Henderson's younger sister in 1954, creating a family that embodied the reconciliation between former enemies. The audience listened in absolute silence as the 2 old men described their transformation from enemy child soldiers to American citizens. Klaus explained that he had become a teacher specifically because he wanted to help children, to give them the guidance and care he had received from the O'Briens. He had taught for 40 years in Boston public schools, always remembering what it felt like to be a frightened foreign child in a strange place. Werner had become a doctor as planned, specializing in pediatric medicine. He had spent his career treating sick children, always seeing in their faces the reflection of his own childhood suffering. Otto had raised 3 children in Worcester, his repair shop becoming a community institution where people brought not just broken machines, but their own stories of struggle and redemption. All 4 men had built lives that honored the mercy they had been shown. Hans had eventually found his brother in a displaced persons camp in 1947. They had reunited in Germany, rebuilt their lives there, and Hans had become a teacher as well, dedicating himself to ensuring German students learned the full truth about their country's history. Dieter had worked in reconstruction efforts, helping rebuild the physical and moral infrastructure of West Germany. Fritz had reconciled with his parents and become a musician like his father, using music as a language of healing. Klaus concluded his speech by holding up the battered canteen he still carried, the one that had belonged to his father. "This," he told the audience, "reminds me of where I came from. But this," he gestured to his American flag lapel pin, "reminds me of who I chose to become."